I wanted to talk about, to start, this idea of stacking functions. How is an apple tree more than just an apple tree, right? People think of apple tree often and we think of the food production there, but I would support, if we look a little deeper, that there's a whole lot more going on there. There's food, there's shade. If you put it on the west side of your house or the southwest side of your house, it's going to shade your house in the summertime, which in our Mediterranean climate here in California is lovely, and then drop its leaves so that sun actually hits the house in the wintertime. There's beauty in the spring when that thing is in full blossom and pretty beautiful, and it's lush and abundant, covered with fruit as well. Wildlife habitat, both for the bees and then all kinds of other critters that might call that place home. And then the tree itself is creating microclimates as well all around it. The southwest side is different than the southeast side, and maybe you can nestle little plants next to it, different ones in each one of those little microclimates. Or the microclimate it's creating in your backyard as it evapotranspirates over your back patio maybe, and it's just sort of natural cooling. And then there's a structure of the tree itself, which is maybe a climbing structure for children, or it's an anchor for one side of your laundry line, perhaps. There's a visual barrier opportunity in the whole thing. It's a living pump, which might be pumping up your gray water, or your rainwater, which we'll talk about more. And then the winter time, or in the fall, when it drops its leaves, it's actually self-mulching, and the pruning's coming off of it, or mulch as well. And then at the end of its life, maybe it becomes wood for something in your backyard, using the structural beams, or maybe you're breaking it down and just using it as firewood or growing mushrooms on it. And so there's all these sort of latent functions there, right? The tree could be serving all these, but it really depends how we put it in relationship to the other elements. I talked about that passive solar piece of things where it's shading the southwest corner of your house, perhaps, if planted appropriately. And it only sort of realizes that function if it's placed and designed into the landscape in such a way where those interactions are occurring like that. So when we talk about plant communities, I think it's important to just step back and talk about the functions that different individuals, different plants might play in those communities. And we often talk about this community, or a well-rounded community, as a plant guild, a group of plants that are all playing on top of, or playing off of each other. And so you have a food producer. That's kind of the obvious one. I think people often jump straight to that. But then oftentimes we'll also put in a nitrogen fixer, which is a plant that has a symbiotic relationship with a certain set of bacteria in its roots, where it's actually taking atmospheric nitrogen and fixing it, changing it into a form that is then usable by other plants around it. And there's kind of only a small subset of plants in the overall plant community that do that. Beans and peas in that family are the most common one, but we'll talk about some others in here. And then plants that make mulch as well is a great one. How do we create our own fertility, grow our own fertility on the site? Oftentimes this is like the sunflower that has those big soft leaves, or comfrey is another great one, or squashes, those big soft leaves that really quickly integrate back into the soil. And then insectary plants, plants that both support the insects that we want in our garden, like the sunflower here is going to bring in the bees, or you might have something in the umbel family, or like yarrow that brings in the parasitic wasps that are going to feed on your aphids and keep that population low. Or you might have plants such as the Mexican marigold, which actually repels plants you don't want, like nematodes in your garden as well. And so again, thinking of the different functions of the plants, you can then integrate them into communities. And the great thing about this is oftentimes you'll come across really great plants that do multiple of these functions. So you have function stacks within a single plant as well, and that's where it really gets juicy. So sort of continuing along, I guess one of those that is kind of that beautiful function stack plant is an autumn olive, which is a plant we have here at the Permaculture Skills Center. It's in the Eleagnus family, which is actually not in the bean family, but it fixes nitrogen. It produces these small berries, which aren't necessarily stellar in their own as a culinary delight, but they're fun to pick and just kind of munch on, nosh on while you're cruising around the garden. But they're crazy high in lycopenes, a beneficial antioxidant. And like in terms of, people often eat tomatoes for lycopenes, but these are off the charts in comparison to those. And then this plant as well is fixing nitrogen, but it's also a wonderful mulch maker. And then you could take this plant and prune it almost all the way to the ground every year, or prune it back really heavily, and then use that nitrogenous mulch around the tops, the leaves and whatnot, and drop that straight into your garden to self-mulch the plants around it. And as above, so below, there's a whole root die-off that goes on as well when you do a heavy pruning like that. And so the roots die off below, and again, dose the soil with nitrogen. And then in the spring, the flowers on these also bring in the beneficial insects. The bees really enjoy these. And so, I just want to put this one on there as kind of a really wonderful plant that integrates all those different functions that we talked about in our plant guild. And so when you're prioritizing, if you have a small space, something like this might go higher on the list because it's serving all these different functions.